Part 5. Right, so clearly 5 videos is beginning to get a little bit ridiculous. I said in my first video that I fully anticipated this discussion would span multiple videos, but I was thinking multiple, like 3 videos or so was what I was thinking in my head when I said that I clearly had no self-awareness of how long-winded I am and how much I would ramble. So, I know this is ridiculous. I'm not even sure if anyone's still going to be watching at 5 videos, but whatever happens, this will be the last one. When my 30 minutes runs out on this video, anything I didn't get around to saying will just be left unsaid. I will link to the written blog post that I'm basing these videos off of in the description down below, and you can go there for my full thoughts. But I'm just going to talk as much as I can for the next 30 minutes and see how much ground we can make. So the next thing to talk about is the authorship of the Gospels. Now, as I said in my very first video, one of the things I learned when going to Calvin College is that even at conservative Christian colleges or conservative Christian institutions, it's well known in the scholarship department that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not actually written by the apostles Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were written later by a different community. And again, this isn't what they tell you in Sunday school growing up, but this is what they acknowledge at most mainstream Christian institutions and Catholic ones as well, I believe, based on conversations I've had with Catholic friends. A friend of mine who grew up Catholic and went to Catholic schools told me that when he was in high school, the priest told them that the Gospels were not actually written by the apostles. Robin Lane Fox, then, somewhat surprisingly, is arguing that at least 2 of the Gospels, sorry, not at least 2 were written by the apostles. So he believes that the book of Luke and Acts were written by Luke, or at the very least, one of the traveling companions of Paul. And he believes that the Gospel of John was written by John, or at the very least, one of Jesus' disciples. Matthew and Mark, he's fully in line with the scholarship consensus that these were not written by the apostles. But for Luke and John, he is. So, briefly, I guess, what are the reasons to suppose why Luke or John might be written by Luke and John, or at least an eyewitness account? Well, it's the traditional reason. For example, the book of Acts at various points switches into the we pronoun, from which church tradition and also Robin Lane Fox believed that we must have been somebody traveling with Paul. So either possibly Luke, or at the very least just some traveling companion of Paul. The book of John refers constantly to someone called the beloved disciple who is never named, and is hypothesized by church tradition that the reason that he never says his name is because of, I don't know, modesty is what my Bible teacher told me, although the beloved disciple is not a terribly modest name to go under. But my Bible teacher told me that John didn't like drawing attention to himself, so he called it as the beloved disciple. And I believe that I'm fairly sure that the reason that the beloved disciple is equated with John is because John is not named anywhere else in the Gospel. So the disciple who's not named, who always comes up as the beloved disciple, must be John. Then at the very end of the Gospel, there's a little note that said, by the way, the beloved disciple is the one that wrote down all these things that we are now reading, and we know that his testimony is true because he wrote it all down for us, or something like that. Bart Ehrman has pointed out that this passage means that it's not claiming to be from an eyewitness, because it says, we know that his testimony is true, meaning there's we, the people reading it, and there's him, the person who wrote it, but that we includes the we know that must include the person who is writing that is included when the we. So we meaning you the reader and me the writer together know that his testimony is true. I said Bart Ehrman said that. What I mean to say that is I first heard this argument from Bart Ehrman. It's an old argument though, and Robin Lane Fox is well aware of it. Robin Lane Fox says that a later editor must have added this part, which is, I believe, also what church tradition says, is that there was a later editor who added the we know that his tradition is that, added the we know that his testimony is true part. Okay, so that's the reason why Robin Lane Fox tends toward credulity here and believing that these are actually the testimonies of the people church tradition has assigned to them. The reasons for not believing that they were written by Luke and John are numerous and convincing. And even conservative religious colleges say that Luke and John couldn't possibly have written the Gospels of Luke and John. They're not doing it out of a sense of fair-mindedness. It's because there's very good evidence. So going into this briefly, the Gospel of Luke is, we'll talk about Luke first and then we'll jump into John. So reasons why the Gospel of Luke couldn't possibly have been written by the Apostle Luke. So the Gospel of Luke is based off of the Gospel of Mark, even though it doesn't say that explicitly. If you do an analysis of it, you find that large passages of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all word for word identical. This can't happen by coincidence alone, which means somebody must be copying from somebody else. Scholars believe that Mark's Gospel was written first and then Matthew and Luke were copying from Mark's Gospel. There are numerous reasons for this. One reason is that Mark's Gospel is the shortest, so that Matthew and Luke are adding material. There's also linguistic reasons. It looks like Matthew and Luke are making corrections to Mark's Gospel or softening the language, or when there's a problematic passage, they're smoothing it out, making the Jesus look a little bit less angry in Matthew and Luke than he does in Mark. So for all these reasons, scholars think that Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke were smoothing it over. Now, the earliest Christian documents we have are the letters of Paul. I know that's not, this comes as a bit of a surprise because that's not how they're arranged in order in the Bible, right? In the Bible, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts, and then the letters of Paul. But in terms of what was actually written first, Paul's letters were written first, and Paul's missionary journeys were sometime around 50 AD, I believe. Paul seems to be unaware of any of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He doesn't talk about stuff that's in the Gospel of Luke, like the Virgin Mary or the birth of Christ. That all seems to be a later Christian tradition. He doesn't have any of their quotations about Jesus, the Beatitudes, or in any of Jesus' famous sayings from the Gospels. Paul doesn't appear to know them. Secular scholars believe that Mark, the earliest gospel, must have been written around 70 AD because it references the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, if you're a Christian, I guess you could believe that Jesus was prophesying, and then that's why Jesus knows about the destruction of Jerusalem. Although Robin Lane Fox is not Robin Lane Fox is not a Christian. He's an atheist, so he doesn't get to use that dodge. They believe it was written around 70 AD because it references the destruction of Jerusalem, plus the previous argument I already mentioned, where during the time of Paul, nobody seemed to be aware of these Gospels or the stories that they contained, or the quotations from the Gospels. So Matthew and Luke, of course, are both copying from the Gospel of Mark, so they're placed sometime after 70 AD. I don't know, 75 or 80 or something like that, I believe is the range for the dating that scholars give it. So just in terms of the timeline, we're already removed a bit from the traveling companion of Paul. Although it's theoretically possible he could still have been alive at that time. He would have been an old man by then. It would have been really old. Because you figure if Paul's traveling around in 50 AD and his traveling companions, I don't know how old. Luke was supposed to be a doctor, right? So, well, no, it's. I guess he could be alive. But the other reasons are the theology in Luke Acts doesn't seem to match up with the theology of Paul. So we've got a different theology going on. Also, the account that's given of Paul's missionary journey in Acts contradicts Paul's own account. So in Galatians 1 and 2, Paul gives an account of his journeys. Galatians is one of the undisputed letters of Paul, meaning it's something that everybody, all scholars agree Paul definitely wrote. The book of Acts contradicts the narrative that Paul himself gives of his journeys. What other arguments are there? Yeah, I think that's basically it. There are, of course, the we passages that show up in the book of Acts, where the narration switches all of a sudden to we. But one of the oddities of the we passages is they just come out of nowhere. There's no explanation of who we are or how we joined up with Paul. It just switches all of a sudden to the pronoun we in the middle of some of the ship voyages. And there are numerous possible alternative explanations for this. Apparently this was something that ancient writers used to show immediacy of the text. Some people also say that this was a convention used when describing a ship journey in the ancient world as going over to we. Or it could have been that those sections that contain the we source come from a source that somebody else was editing together later. Because, I mean, even if we admit that the gospel was written by Luke, we still have Acts 1 through 12, which is talking about the apostles back in Jerusalem, you know, Peter and James and all those guys, not the missionary journeys of Paul, which don't kick in into the later half of Acts. So even if it is a traveling companion of Paul, you know, he must be drawing it upon different sources. So once we admit that there's somebody who's editing together different sources, then who's to say that it was the traveling companion of Paul was the person who edited it all together, or it was somebody else who just had access to these documents, etc. So those are, to my understandings, the problems with the Gospel of Luke and Acts being written by Luke. Oh, sorry. I forgot to say something. It's Luke and Acts are written by the same author. So they've got the same introduction, then the same person is writing them to the same Theophilus. So those two books are counted as a unit, and by everyone, by secular scholars and Christians, etc. Now, Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's not one of the synoptic Gospels. So there's no problem with somebody copying out of somebody else. John is not, the Gospel of John is not copying from Mark. But there are a number of other problems with it. For one, it's written in a highly literate Greek style. Jesus' apostles were illiterate Aramaic-speaking fishermen. The book of Acts explicitly tells us that Peter and John were uneducated, illiterate. It mentions at one point that the high priests were so surprised that these illiterate fishermen were able to speak so intelligently. So he doesn't know Greek and he is illiterate. And so that the highly stylized Greek prose is in of itself suspicious. In addition, Jesus and all his disciples spoke Aramaic, but the Gospel of John relies upon a lot of wordplay and conversation, where the puns focus on the Greek. Bart Ehrman talks about this in his book, the puns that are going on in Born Again, where the Greek word has two meanings, a pun that doesn't work in Aramaic. So something I remember from my own Sunday school days is one teacher I used to have and one pastor I used to have both made a big deal. You may remember this if you've been to Sunday school. The passage in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is saying to Peter, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus says, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus asks him 3 times. And Peter is hurt because Jesus has asked him 3 times. And this seems to be a reference to the fact that Peter denied Jesus 3 times. But what your pastor may have told you, if they wanted to get into some of this, is that in the actual Greek, there's a bit more going on there. Jesus is saying to Peter, "Peter, do you agape me?" And Peter keeps responding, "Yes, Lord, I phileo you." Agape meaning a deep kind of Greek love, and phileo meaning a brotherly love. What my pastor never mentioned, or my Bible school teacher, and what I never put together on my own, at least when I was younger, is that Peter and Jesus weren't speaking Greek. They were speaking Aramaic. So that agapeo-phileo distinction doesn't work. And my understanding is it doesn't work in English, and it also wouldn't have worked either in Aramaic. Although I think there are some Christian apologists who talk about maybe the tone of voice that they were using may have been different there or something like that. But I think that's just a ridiculous explanation for the 2 different types of love. So point being, the Gospel of John uses a lot of wordplay in Greek that wouldn't have worked in the Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus and his disciples were speaking. Also, Gospel of John presents a most advanced Christology. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is the Messiah, he is the Son of God, but he is not God incarnate. He is not God. In the Gospel of John, both the narrator of John and Jesus himself are making claims for Jesus' divinity. So, the argument is that this is a later gospel that comes from a period where Christian mythology had developed to the point where they were now thinking that Jesus was equivalent with God. It's thought unlikely that the historical Jesus actually made these claims, because if he was actually going around saying that he was God, and if his followers believed that he was God, then it's funny that that didn't make it into Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it's funny also that it didn't make it into the letters of Paul, although there is a passage of Paul that depends on the interpretation. Jesus, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. That passage is from Paul, but it's something that scholars debate over the actual meaning of. And either way, there's this weird thing, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped in there. Also, the book of John presents an antagonism between Jesus' followers and the Jews, which is viewed as an anachronism. Dale Martin mentions this in his lectures. This seems to be a later development, which was written back into the stories of Jesus in the Gospel of John, but was not actually present at that time. And then also, the Gospel of John contains some rather miraculous stories that are not in the other Gospels. For example, Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Not to mention that Jesus rising himself from the dead. Now, if you're a Christian and you really believe that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead and raised himself from the dead, then I guess fair enough. But Robin Lane Fox again is an atheist, so it's strange that Robin Lane Fox is arguing that this is supposedly an eyewitness document. Okay, so those are all the reasons against it. And if you go to the Amazon page for this book and you read the reviews of it, you will note that I am not the first person to notice this. Lots of people are criticizing Robin Lane Fox for his view that Luke and John were written by the apostles Luke and John, or at least equivalents. It's a very unusual view for a scholar to take. Fox is not unaware of the issues, to his credit, and he does address them, but then he dismisses them briefly. I'll talk about his discussion of Luke here. So he's addressing all the arguments that scholars have that Luke isn't actually written by the apostles. And he says, many critics still dispute this awkward fact that Luke and Acts were written by a traveling companion of Paul. Partly because they think the author's theology is late. There is nothing conclusive here. And above all, because they believe that his book clashes with the writings of Paul. I do not find these clashes inseparable. Some are felt to be factual. I share the view, however, that the counsel in Acts 15 derives from the events told by Paul more accurately in Galatians 2, 1 through 9. Some are intellectual. Acts does not contain all the theology of Paul's letters. Some suggest a different context. Paul's letters appear to address Gentile Christians, but Acts tells how Paul began by preaching with some success in the Jews' synagogue, often in the cities to which he later sent letters. So that's all from page 209, and that's Robin Lane Fox talking about the objections to Luke being written by a traveling companion of Paul, and then dismissing those objections. And then he goes on to further dismiss them in the next few sentences. So quoting from the same page. We must not overestimate the companion's closeness. Acts's author could well have made mistakes about Paul's early career or about periods when they were apart. Acts does insist on the Jews' hostility in most cities, including Thessalonica and Corinth, to which Paul writes. Successes in the synagogues may have been very few, so that the majority in Acts' churches, just as in Paul's letters, were Gentiles or Gentile God-fearers who previously attended synagogues. As for Paul's theology, the surviving epistles are only a small part of his opinions. His all things to all men and are directed to existing Christians, not to possible converts, like most of Acts' speeches. A traveling companion could well have missed the theology that we now have in them. Acts' author did not use the letters as a source. Pupils, even, see masters very differently. Socrates taught both Plato and Xenophon, but their books about him are remarkably different. Also from 209. So in my opinion, he's bringing up all the issues that he knows about, why scholars don't accept that Luke wrote Luke and Acts. And then he just seems to be hand-waving them away with very shallow statements, to my mind, that really do not address, I think, the problems. And doesn't really provide any other evidence for why he thinks that it was written by a traveling companion of Paul, other than the we passages. Now, I'm not going to quote his sections on the Gospel of John, but it's very much the same pattern. He mentions most, not all, but most of the reasons scholars have to object to it. and then just hand waves them away. It puzzles me why he's so credulous on this point. Why he thinks that Luke Acts is written by Luke just on the basis of the we passages, and why John is based on the testimony of the beloved disciple just because the Gospel of John says that it is. Because he knows that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus and 1st and 2nd Peter are all blatant forgeries, as he called them, but blatant, dishonest forgeries with the intent to trick people, is what he wrote. He also writes that the Gospel of Matthew, even though the Gospel itself doesn't claim to be from Matthew, he thinks that there's some degree of deception in the church tradition that assigns it to Matthew. So if he knows all this, why isn't he more skeptical about where those we passages come from? I don't get it. Okay. There's a section here next on the canon of the Bible, which I don't think I'm going to have time to discuss at length. But basically, his point is that the Christian church has never agreed on which books are canonical or which are not. There's, of course, the Catholic Bible has what we Protestants call the Apocrypha in it. That's mostly related to the Old Testament or to the Jewish Septuagint, but still, the Ethiopian church has different books in it than the Western church. There have been various lists of accepted canon throughout various points in early church history. And then still to this day, again, the different Bibles with the Catholics and the Ethiopians, and the Greek Orthodox Church he mentions as well. So this he argues, and I agree, that this would disqualify the view that we know that the canon is inspired by God. We know that the selection of books that are in the Bible is inspired by God because God's hand was guiding the early church in order to form this perfect group of books that became our Bible. Robin Lane Fox argues, well, if there's divine inspiration going on here, then why did the Catholics, the Protestants, the Ethiopians, and the Greek Orthodox all end up with different canon? And I agree with that completely. Okay, other things here. That's more or less actually my review. I don't really have a lot else to say about it. This is a minor point, but he uses rape as a metaphor repeatedly for Christians going through the Old Testament to find passages that supported their view of Jesus as the Messiah. His view is that they're taking these passages out of context. So he talks about it, he uses the metaphor of rape, which is not great. I think back in 1991, it was a different time. It was before the internet and before a lot of this hypersensitivity, but it grates on the ears a bit to read it now. Grates on the ears to read it. But you know what I mean. I mentioned a quote from an Amazon reviewer who thought that his comma placement was really irritating, which I kind of agree with, but didn't really spoil my experience of the book. And yeah, I think actually that's everything. That's everything I wanted to say about this book. I finished in time. How about that? Only took me 5 videos.